Welcome everyone to Decolonial Dialogues. I am pleasured to be with Professor Liam Liburd, who is an Associate Professor in Black British History at Durham University. Since the violence and the riots began targeting racialized communities in this country, it's been, on the one side, it felt a little bit shocking, but then on the other side, it also felt really familiar. And it was kind of surprising to me that when I would look around, even among close comrades, people treated these violent episodes as if they were an aberration, as if, for example, the 1958 Notting Hill riots didn't happen, or the 1919 riots in Liverpool didn't happen. I mean, in general, the way that this conversation has been had is that the far right is an aberration, the far right is not British. And reading the work of Professor Liam Liburd has been really enlightening in showing that intuitive sense that I feel and many of us feel, especially racialized people feel, is not unwarranted. Actually, the far right, as much as we'd like to imagine it as being influenced from our neighbors from France or in the 30s or 40s from Italy and Germany, is actually quite a British tradition. Thank you to Liam for joining us. We really appreciate having you.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I guess the first question I'd like to ask is, how foreign is, foreign in the sense, is the far right and fascism? And then much more importantly, what's the relationship between the far right and colonialism? I know those are like two separate questions, but maybe you can, I don't know, take a stab at them both.
I mean, I think I'd approach that first question by answering it with a question, I suppose, which is, how foreign is racism to Britain? And I think that's kind of how I kind of conceptualize the far right, that they are part of a broader politics of race, politics of race and racism in Britain and in British history. If you look at the kind of very earliest kind of British fascists in the 1920s, they are looking to Italy, they're looking to Mussolini. But the way in which they're looking to Mussolini, I think, is kind of important to pay attention to. They're looking at what's happening in Italy and thinking, this would be useful for quieting the empire. This would be useful for putting down Indian nationalism in India in the kind of late teens, early 20s. It would be useful in dealing with Ireland, which is in the kind of middle of a revolutionary situation in that period. It would be useful in dealing with Egyptian nationalism, which there's also kind of anti-colonial rebellion happening in Egypt in that period. They look at that and they think they see it as that kind of extra parliamentary, violent, repressive politics that's been used successfully in the empire and the empire's history, in their opinion. And they see fascism in those terms. They see it. One of the figures that the early fascists really like is General Dyer. General Dyer, responsible for the 1919 Amritsar Massacre in the colonial Punjab. And they directly, actually, the first self-identifying British fascist organisation is called the British Fascisti. And you can see there the kind of conscious modelling on Italy. But the British person that for them is the equivalent of Mussolini is General Dyer, which I think kind of tells you a lot about how British fascists located themselves in Britain, what they took from foreign fascism was, this chimes with something British, rather than seeing it as something that needed to be imported into Britain. I mean, if they're importing it into Britain from anywhere, it wasn't from Italy, it was from the empire, or at least, that's how they would have it.
Yeah. Also, just to clarify to readers, the Amritsar Massacre happened, I believe, in 1919. And it was when a group of Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs got together in a ceremony, but the British authorities had a conspiracy theory that they were organizing for nationalist agitation, and so allowed a huge massacre to take place that killed thousands. And the general who you mentioned, General Dyer, when he came back to Britain, he became a cause célèbre for people like Rudyard Kipling and others, whereas others were had felt that he had gone too far.
Yeah.
And so you're saying also that, and I've read your piece, it's a phenomenal article you wrote on the British Fascisti. A lot of the leaders of the British Fascisti had done their time in the colonies, and that they had also seen the attack against General Dyer as a kind of attack against the empire, and they were worried that the empire was crumbling. I guess that's something that people don't really know much about, but your work really does well to uncover. It's the fact that actually, in many ways, British fascism was made not just here and inspired by Italy, but it was also imported from the colonies by people who were colonial officials. Do you want to maybe expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what you were saying earlier about the way that kind of racism and racial violence is viewed within Britain as kind of aberrant, as an aberration, as something strange or a kind of exceptional occurrence. Sort of where that comes from, I think, is viewing Britain as if it was always a kind of in the national frame. It was always just the British Isles, that we have kind of parliamentary democracy, a kind of formal liberalism, right? But the Britain outside Britain didn't have those things. So actually, in many places, those things were kind of explicitly outlawed, and authoritarianism and a level of political violence was business as usual. Democracy was strange in the colonial empire, and I think that's kind of where I think the authoritarian tradition in British politics comes from. And as you said as well, I talked about in that piece you mentioned, the kind of the second leader of the British fascisti, General R.B.D. Blakeney. He'd been a colonial official in Egypt. He worked on the Egyptian state railways. Before that, fought in several different colonial conflicts in the South African War. He'd been in Khartoum in the kind of 1880s, 1890s as well. They had people like district commissioners who'd been in Ireland in the kind of early 20th century, the kind of revolutionary situation there. Who'd been kind of fighting against Irish Republican revolutionaries, and the way that they see the forces that they think are operating against the empire, that they often racialize as Jewish, are as a kind of massive connected anti-colonial rebellion almost. So it really shapes those experiences really shape the way that they view the world. And even for those members who didn't have direct first-hand experience, I think something that kind of gets forgotten now is the way that the empire also functioned as a kind of vast set of stories, a kind of history in which British boys and girls, but boys particularly, were kind of versed in, thinking about Scout movement, thinking about Kipling, we already mentioned. There's a kind of imaginative ideological tradition of colonialism, as well as the actual kind of experiential kind of colonialism in which so many of these fascists were kind of part.
Yes, absolutely. I guess for me, the question is, what about, let's move maybe a little bit to the 30s and the 40s. So obviously a lot of people know about the Battle of Cable Street. You yourself in your PhD research have interviewed people who were involved in the Battle of Cable Street. But often the way that story gets told is that the fascists were a small group of people who were kind of outliers, and the heroic British people, showed them that this is not what Britain is about. And often the story of anti-fascism in the 30s and 40s is about, white street movements, sometimes also, of course, Jewish street movements who've defended themselves. And that's very, very important part of anti-fascist history. But what part, again, this is a part where in some literature on the history of anti-fascism, I felt the story of the empire kind of gets glossed over. They might mention that there's groups that call themselves, for example, the League of Empire Loyalists, etc. But really, it's not that important. But your work challenges that. Do you want to kind of maybe expand on that a little bit?
I mean, to go back to kind of the 30s and to to anti-fascism in the 30s. I mean, I think, the kind of the street activism, the kind of the British Union of Fascists, the kind of Cable Street stuff was primarily directed. I mean, they were kind of doing a lot of activism in the East End, primarily directed against kind of the Jewish community there. And the Communist Party in Britain, the CPGB, were also very kind of active in kind of organised anti-fascism. But I think it's interesting to look at the way that, for instance, the British Union of Fascists were thinking about the kind of broader empire, the Britain beyond Britain I was talking about earlier. Because around the same time as the Battle of Cable Street, the British Union of Fascists are also campaigning to allow Mussolini to be able to do what he likes in Ethiopia, which he invaded in late 1935. And also present in Britain at that time are kind of anti-colonial Marxist movements like the International African Friends, of Ethiopia. Some of the members of that organization, people like C.L.R. James, people like George Padmore. George Padmore in particular, he's one of the only kind of black intellectuals I've seen kind of explicitly connect the British Union of Fascists to empire in that moment. He writes a book in 1936 called How Britain Rules Africa. It's a study of British colonialism across Africa. And in the introduction to that book, he recollects hearing a news broadcast about a BUF rally that took place in Olympia, the Olympia Conference Centre in West London in 1934, summer of 1934. And it was it's famous in kind of the history of British fascism because it descended into a kind of pitched battle between anti-fascist hecklers and fascist stewards, and BUF attracted widespread condemnation for their kind of rough stewarding of the event. But what Padmore kind of zeroes in on is this: there's a journalist who was in the room in the conference center. He's talking about having overheard two fascists talking to each other, and kind of these two fascists lamenting that they can't treat the crowd as roughly as they treated colonial subjects out east. And Padmore zeroes in on this, and he kind of spots in there's something about fascism that is not only drawing on kind of imperial authoritarian traditions, but is also kind of spreading that tradition into Britain. And so you can kind of see there him drawing those connections together. But at the time, not many people do draw those connections. I mean, the Communist Party of Great Britain I mentioned earlier, because of their pivoting in response to the Moscow kind of set party line, and that party line in the kind of early 1930s shifts from being anti-fascist and anti-colonial to very much being anti-fascist first and anti-colonial second. So that means that they're kind of more willing to get into political alliances with democratic colonial powers like Britain and France against Italy and Germany, and kind of so a lot of there's a separation, I suppose, of anti-fascism and anti-colonialism, which kind of complicates the relationship of black activists with anti-fascism. And I think actually also following that forward maybe goes to explain why kind of some of those historical threads haven't been connected.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating. And I'm really glad that you brought up the International African Friends of Ethiopia, or what becomes the International African Service Bureau, because this is really like a pivotal moment in the history of anti-colonial activism and agitation as well. The birth of, to a degree, right, like the birth of really organized anti-colonial agitation, not like the sporadic type, but really organized, coincides with the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. And I know that like immediately afterwards, people like Amy Ashworth Garvey, Jomo Kenyatta, and then also people like George Padmore, who, as you said, was expelled actually from the Communist Party because he had problems with the new policy of the communists, which was to ally with what they called the democratic imperialisms as opposed to the fascist imperialisms. But this is a lot of historians see this as the inauguration of the independent struggles in many ways, and it's interesting that this is actually an anti-fascist moment because Amy Ashworth Garvey goes to Trafalgar Square and she says, the only thing standing between you and fascism is us. And in many ways, right, aside from those people who, of course, were doing excellent work, fighting fascists in the streets, but also fighting them on the newspapers, fighting them in all of these different kinds of ways. Um, People didn't really recognize the way that maybe we could call it the black left recognized the importance of the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, right?
Mm, mm. Yeah, I mean, I think it all speaks to a much more expansive understanding of fascism, because you can either understand fascism as something that begins and ends with fascist movements, that begins and ends with the BUF. BUF never and in its absolute height had maybe 50,000 members. It did have some really important connections in the 1930s, but it was never in a place where it was going to take kind of power in a sense of Mosley becoming prime minister or that kind of thing. So you can see fascism in those terms as something that's kind of easily vanquished by a kind of counter demonstration, something you can block from passing in East London as they did in Cable Street. They could halt a fascist march, and then that's kind of the end of it. The movement's broken, we're done. Or you can think about it more expansively. You can think about it as something, okay, if fascists drew so much energy and inspiration from the kind of Britain's tradition of authoritarian and colonial violence, then maybe by defeating the BUF, we haven't really defeated fascism. We haven't really defeated British fascism. And that was very much the point that the International African Service Friends, the International African Service Bureau, and before that, the International African Friends of Ethiopia were trying to make. And you can see that in the later 1930s. The International African Service Bureau are really worried that Britain might at any moment settle with Germany and appease them using things like there are Southern African protectorates they think they might offer to Hitler as a means of satisfying Nazi expansionist ambitions. They think they're thinking about various different African colonies that might get handed over. That doesn't happen, but I think it shows in the moment that actually they couldn't see a big difference between British imperialism and National socialism.
That's really interesting. I mean, before we move on post World War II, fascism for the most part is now kind of seen as the opposite of Britishness because of the British involvement in the Second World War. But before we get to that, there was a point where throughout this whole entire period, a lot of the fascists see their cause as intimately tied with the cause of settlers in the colonies very far away. Even when those settlers themselves had their misgivings with the metropolitan government, because maybe the metropolitan government was seen as intervening too much on the violence that settlers could use to maintain their domination over the places that they were dominating. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about that relationship between British fascism and settler colonialism?
I mean, there is, and I think it speaks to the fact that a lot of these activists have had experiences either as kind of colonial military personnel, but also as people who worked out in different colonies in various different roles, and some people who had a go at settling really as well. They very much approach the empire not from the perspective of the kind of metropole. They're not thinking about the empire in the same way that your colonial secretaries or Whitehall are thinking about the empire. They're very much they're coming at it from a settler perspective, and in some ways they speaking about, this goes for the British fascisti, this goes for the British Union fascists. It also goes for a small and very extreme group we haven't talked about called the Imperial Fascist League as well. They're all thinking what fascism will do is it will allow the man on the spot, the settler, the soldier, the district commissioner, to get on with his job. It will invest him with the authority to do what he needs to do in the way that he wants to do it. Now, obviously, there are contradictions with that. So you're going to set up an authoritarian government in Britain and then have kind of an authoritarian government in the colonies, which is kind of allowed to do what it wants. But that's kind of what they imagine fascism will do for them, and will do for kind of the empire. That it will allow the men on the spot to get on with what they want to do.
Mm-hmm. That's really, really interesting. So let's say now we're moving into post 1945, around 1947. So there's lots of conversations with Pakistan and India, etc., on constitutional independence. A huge part of British fascism and the British far right was on the idea of a greater Britain, like Mosley called it. They're seeing this happen. They're really disappointed that they'll lose the empire. Um, what changes then in the British far right? And we're talking about the far right here, the radical far right, in a way that encompasses both British fascism, but also the right wing of the conservatives, for example. Like, what happens to those kinds of ideas at this point, and how does fascism and the right and the far right reconstitute itself?
So, I mean, in some ways, empire becomes even more central because, as you say, in the interwar period, the idea that the empire was falling apart was kind of ludicrous. You've got the British Empire swollen to even greater proportions after the First World War. After the Second World War, things are different. There is a sense that Britain has enlisted the support of India, for instance, on the premise that there will be independence or dominion status or some kind of significant transformation in India's constitutional relationship to the British Empire after the war. I mean, in some ways, the reaction of the British right broadly towards Indian independence is quite muted. And I wonder, I'm speculating, I wonder to what extent that's to do with the fact that it was, by that point, just there was no real serious proposal for how you're going to hold on to it. What the kind of the far right really centering on in the absence of Britain's kind of Asian colonies is the remaining African colonies, in particular the colonies in Southern Africa, Central and Southern Africa. They really hitch Britain's future prosperity to kind of a renewed go at colonialism in Africa. I mean, Mosley comes back in 1948 with a group called the Union Movement, and the whole center of his post-war politics is this idea of, the slogan was Europe a nation, Africa empire of Europe. So Europe a nation basically meant a kind of fascist version of European integration. Africa, the empire of Europe, meant a kind of a united, renewed colonial domination of Africa. Where Africa would be, these grand plans of partitioning Africa into a white, black, and Arab area, a kind of a black area that was kind of the least kind of fertile, basically parts of Africa, sort of southern Africa, where it built up kind of existing white settler communities, and then a kind of northern Arab part of Africa. He developed this plan with a guy called Oswald Pirro, who had been a minister of the Interior in South Africa in the 1930s, and was a Nazi sympathizer, quite openly a Nazi sympathizer. He develops this plan with Pirro in the late 40s, and that really becomes the lodestar of his new movement.
Wow. So yeah, I'm learning this myself. So that means it's a lot more intimately tied with imperialism, isn't it? Fascism than is often said.
Yeah.
So that's the union movement has had to rebrand itself, right? So, I mean, they used to call themselves fascists openly. Now they're calling themselves a union movement. I'm sure they're probably still calling themselves fascists openly, but there's a rebranding that happens. And I think this is really important, right? Because post-World War II, fascism itself is seen as, in the triumphant form of what it means to be British it means to be the ones who defeated fascism. The far right really has to rebrand. And what happens then now, I mean, a lot of Black British history got talked about post Windrush. We've had this entire conversation so far pre Windrush. What happens now when you have more immigration coming in? The 1948 Nationality Bill says that people who are from the colonies are entitled to British citizenship. What happens to the agenda of the far right, both when it comes to their imperialist and colonial agenda, but also domestically?
Yeah. I mean, their imperialism very much informs their opposition to immigration. I've only talked about one of the groups so far, the Union Movement. I'll go on to talk about some others in a moment. But the Union Movement really is one of the earliest organized white supremacist groups, you might say, to start campaigning against immigration from the new Commonwealth. So in 1952, Mosley sends out this circular to the Union Movement branches saying, I'm setting forth a policy on the colour question, he calls it, and he argues for what he calls a policy of apartheid for Britain. And what that means is not apartheid within Britain in the same way you have apartheid within South Africa. It means apartheid across the British Empire. So the idea, fairly crudely, is white people, Britain is white, that should be for white people. We should send all the non-white people back to wherever they come from, whether it's the Caribbean or Africa. He doesn't mention specific African nations, he just says Africa. It's a really kind of crude geography for racists, I guess. And the first campaigns the Union Movement do against immigration are in Brixton in the London County Council elections in the same year, 1952, under the slogan "Keep Brixton White," which people have kind of claimed was actually kind of misunderstood by the media because it was often abbreviated as KBW. They misunderstood it as "Keep Britain White," which actually later goes on to become a kind of quite famous anti-immigration immigration slogan. So their council candidates try that line out there in Brixton. It doesn't work out terribly well, but I think it's interesting in the sense that you can see in that campaign a lot of the ways that kind of anti-immigration rhetoric is still, or goes on to be articulated, and actually in some ways is still articulated now. These kind of visions of the blacks taking over street by street of London becoming a little Harlem, which is a kind of line that the activists use quite a lot. It doesn't really pay off for them electorally. It doesn't pay off for them electorally in Brixton. They do slightly better in East London, but that's because they've got kind of, they've got bases of support that go back into the 1930s. Where they try it again, and where I suppose they have, they get some traction again, if not electoral success, is in Notting Hill. So they're in Notting Hill very shortly before the riots break out in late August, early September 1958, and then they kind of really establish a presence there afterwards. You can see newspaper articles at the time talking about UN speakers, whipping up crowds in the riots in Notting Hill. There are other groups on the scene there as well. We mentioned the League of Anti-Loyalists earlier. That group's founded in 1953, I think, by a former member of the BUF, a former member of Mosley's British Union of Fascists, a South African journalist called A.K. Chesterton. I think he's second cousin of the writer G.K. Chesterton. And he founds this organization, which is much more pitched at right-wing conservatives, but also kind of includes a lot of old-fashioned fascists as well, though, again, they avoid that term. Now, the League of Anti-Colonialists is very slow to start campaigning against immigration, but what it does do is it kind of raises a new generation of activists who actually break with the League of Anti-Colonialists and found two organizations, one organization called the White Defence League and another one called the National Labour Party. Both of them were on the scene in 1958 campaigning against immigration in Notting Hill. Again, in very, very similar terms to the UN. They're talking about streets by street being taken over. They're talking about black men living off the immoral earnings of white women, essentially, of black men pimping out white women, all the kinds of racist stereotypes that kind of become a feature of anti-immigration rhetoric. The White Defence League as well is very, very deliberately drawing parallels between what's happening in the UK and what's happening in the US. They're really, really keen on kind of this kind of southern states sort of citizens councils, essentially kind of the segregationist South, these kind of organizations that are kind of pro-segregation. So they're drawing in imperial examples. They're drawing in examples from America as well. into this kind of, I suppose, yeah, white supremacist politics, white supremacist British politics. The term fascism has kind of slipped from use. Like, I mean, they don't use the term white supremacist, but I think actually it's an accurate descriptor for what they're trying to do at this point.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. I mean, you talked about the Notting Hill riots in 1958. The riots that we've seen lately, the race riots, which everyone from the media and people, even the media who's created the ideological circumstances which allowed for it to take place in the first place. Um, they actually remind me a lot of the 1958 Notting Hill riots. Do you want to kind of let our audience know what happened there? You also, in your Twitter, you shared a paper which I went and read on how a lot of the people who ended up being arrested in the Notting Hill riots in 1958 actually weren't even from the area. And it was it was the same kind of rhetoric. Do you want to kind of just let people know what happened?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the paper is published open access. It's by a historian called Christopher Hilliard. It's fantastic. It should be available to your listeners, and they should read it as well. But I'll kind of give you a summary there, because I think it really gets to the heart of like what actually went down in Notting Hill in 1958. Basically, a lot of the people arrested for their part in the rioting were actually white residents of a nearby, fairly affluent white community, I think called Notting Dale. And you can sort of, Christopher Hilliard kind of understands the riots there as they were not riots between black migrants and white residents who objected to having to live next to black migrants. What they were residents from somewhere else who'd come in to try and claim Notting Hill as a white space, which they saw was being turned into a black space. So it was very much, it wasn't kind of a white working class community expressing their grievances. It was a kind of an assertion of a defensive white politics. I mean, a defensive, I suppose, white supremacist politics, which wasn't necessarily, it wasn't that all those people were members of the union movement or followers of the union movement. It was that their kind of nervous sense in their own whiteness chimed with the message of the union movement and the message of the White Defence League and the message of that other organisation I mentioned, the National Labour Party. And that's what drives them. It's a series of kind of violence over several nights, the riots themselves. And in the aftermath of those riots, two things happen. Well, actually, three things happen. It starts to the kind of subsequent press commentary starts to turn into a discourse about how the only way to have good race relations is to restrict immigration. The riots are blamed not on racism, not on the rioters, but on the targets, victims, and essentially the riots, on immigration, on the presence of people of colour, rather than on racism. Secondly, the kind of aftermath of tension and violence leads to the murder of an Antiguan man, Kelso Cochrane, in I think that's May 1959. That case was never solved. The files on the Metropolitan Police files on that case are starting to be released after many, many years of being embargoed. The first of them was released this summer. I've had a look at it. It's a fascinating file. You can go see it in the National Archives if you're interested. It reveals several different things. In some ways, things that British people of colour will be familiar with already. The Metropolitan Police did not lift a finger to really try and solve this murder. That they disavowed the fact that it was a racial murder, and that there are some parts of that file where there's one particular suspect the police had who had already been in prison for stabbing. Had already been in prison for stabbing two black men, and when he was released from prison, said, "I will stab the first black man I see." And it's sort of amazing the police didn't manage to catch that the murderer. What's also interesting about that file is it contains evidence that there was a lot of suspicion that the murderer might have been a member of Mosley's union movement. I don't think ultimately they were, but I think what that shows is the way that, it's difficult to think about the politics of race in Britain separate from, or rather to kind of invert that actually, it's difficult to think about the far right as entirely separate from the politics of race in Britain. That they're part of the scenery, they're part of the story. And that leads me on to the third thing that comes out of the riots. That is Moses' attempt to capitalize on the racism that they kind of expressed and stand for Parliament for the city of North Kensington in the upcoming 1959 general election. And he holds one of the early campaign meetings on the site of Cochrane's murder. So I think whether or not, Mosley or one of Mosley's recruits murdered Councillor Cochrane, I think they do lay a kind of political claim to the murder in having that meeting, and actually, I suppose, in building their presence there afterwards. And that Kristen Hilliard article also mentions that a local councillor employed a researcher to go along to Mosley's meetings and to take notes about what was being said. And they make fascinating reading. I went and saw the notes last summer. They're in Queen Mary University in London's archive. And they're fascinating because they show you how little anti-immigration rhetoric has changed. And I was thinking about them again during the riots a couple of weeks ago. It's all, we need to take our country back. We need to defend our way of life. It's one law for blacks. It's another law for whites. That saying, the language of siege, the language of streets being taken over, the language of places not being safe, even the language of we need to protect our children actually as well, which is kind of another interesting resonance with the kind of contemporary riots.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, it's a shift happens after those riots where, people like Sivananda, Stuart Hall, others, I think lots of people lots of people were making the argument that in many ways, okay, so, Mosley isn't successful necessarily electorally after this, although, the union movement had its contribution to the riots, but that somehow a concession is made by the British establishment to the politics of the far right, and that happens through like the 1962 immigration bill. And so all of a sudden, it's not just the street movement which is going after Black communities, but it's also, for example, now also the police working and the immigration officer who's deciding who gets to come in and who doesn't. And within Black anti-fascist thought, these two are tied together, and this is kind of where a divergence happens, because for other people who call themselves as part of the anti-fascist current, it's only about fascists, the fascist people, and it's not necessarily about the marriage between the far right and the state. Do you want to maybe give people a sense of what immigration was like before this bill, and then what immigration looked like afterwards? Because maybe many people and many of our listeners don't know about the way that immigration used to work here in the UK.
I mean, the history of immigration law in Britain is a really fascinating one. So before 1962, it was essentially governed by an act you mentioned earlier, Mohammed, the 1948 British Nationality Act. And what that act did is essentially formalised a relationship that had been in place for many years before that, of basically, if you were a British colonial subject, you had the right to come and settle in Britain. So people like in the 1930s, people like C.L.R. James and George Padmore as British subjects, as British colonial subjects, they were able to come to Britain no problem. Now, it's worth saying that even though that principle was in place, there had always been tinkering. There had always been racist exceptions. For instance, in the 1920s and 30s, the government used a series of what were called aliens orders to essentially harass and deport British colonial subjects working in the shipping industry. There was a lot of denying of documents. Again, I mean, there'll be resonances here to the Windrush scandal. There are a lot of basically, even where people had documents, even where people could prove that they were British colonial subjects, they were still, the government could still kind of, contrive the means to deport them or to register them as aliens. There's some really interesting kind of British civil rights work done by an organisation called the League of Coloured Peoples, which some of your listeners may have heard of in the 1930s around this, as well as by kind of organisations of black shipping industry workers. But that's kind of another story. If you're interested in that story, Laura Tabili is a fantastic historian who's written a book all about that. But yeah, to return to the subject of British immigration law, so theoretically there's this openness. What the 1962 Act does is start to close the door. It links the ability to come to Britain to having work vouchers. And there's also this introduction or creeping introduction of making it basically harder for you to come to Britain if you don't have relatives who are British. Now, that's not explicitly racialized, right? But obviously, you're more likely to have recently British relatives if you are, for instance, an Australian, or you're living in southern Rhodesia, or you're living in South Africa, because the kind of the links of immigration go back further, I guess, right, or nearer, I suppose, than someone who's only recently come to Britain for the first time from Trinidad or Jamaica. So there's this kind of underlying racialization of immigration. I mean, it's always been there, I suppose. That I mean, immigration law has always been like that. I guess it's not so much a change as the names of the acts change, right? And the extent to which there are like formal kind of legal principles in place changes as well. A lot of the black activism in the 1960s by people like Claudia Jones and the West Indian Gazette involves trying to expose this racism, to point the underlying racism, and say these laws are kind of backdoor apartheid, essentially. And they do talk about it in those terms as well.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, right? At that time, you could actually make the analogy. People take it for granted so much, but at that time, people clearly made the analogy between the way that borders work and the way that apartheid works. I guess I know that because we don't have too much time left, and we've only got to the 60s so far, and there's a huge gap. But nevertheless, I kind of want to just kind of jump to what's going on right now in light of this kind of conversation that we've had so far. We've obviously established that this stuff has happened. It's not new. Is there, a lot of the way in which the conversation is happening is, and this is probably what happened in the aftermath of the 1919 riots in Liverpool, which led to some of those Alien Act in the 20s and the Immigration Act in 62, which happened at the aftermath of the 1958 Notting Hill riots. Again, there's this thing where people treat it like, oh, what's happened? There's something different. Somehow Britain has gone in the wrong direction, and this is totally aberrant. And these are the kinds of conversations we're seeing even on the left-wing media, even on social media, where people are saying, well, maybe immigration is a bad thing, or, maybe immigration is depressing wages. Should we concede at least? Should we have some kind of humane policy where we can maintain our multicultural Britain while, and this idea, obviously, of maybe absolving the working class, or the elites, etc., from racism. For example, Boris Johnson recently wrote in his one of his columns that there was a poll that was done which said that something like 30% of people sympathized with the race riots or race protests. Another on 12%, and I think this was a YouGov poll. 12% said that they even thought violence might be an answer to their problem of immigration. And then there was another poll that was done by a smaller group here in here closer to Manchester, and they were saying that actually, when they did a poll of 1,200 people, they found that 30% of the people they talked to, and they insist that it's a representative sample, actually said that they supported the violence. And so Boris Johnson writes in his column, well, if 30% people support this, including people supporting violence, they can't all be racist. and that almost like the accusation of racism is worse than the actual manifestation of racism.
Mm.
How can we change the framing of this conversation, basically? I mean, how do we make it clear that it is possible for people to be racist,
Mm.
and make that,
Mm.
the priority of movements who want to, fight for justice and everything like that? How do we talk about this complexity? I mean, I know in a series of tweets
Mm.
you also talked about this. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean the question of class and race and the way that they've historically interacted is really complicated. I think the line I try to walk is the white working class is a political construction. It is not, the working class is multi-ethnic. Um, that is a fact, both within Britain and globally, right? Um, but within that construction has been constructed both by middle and upper class politicians to try and enlist the support of working class people. But it is also, if you look at the history of British history and British Labour politics, it has also been constructed by the white section of the working class itself as a means of claiming certain rights and privileges as fellow members of the white race. You can see it in the late 19th and early 20th centuries with something that Jonathan Hislop, this historian, calls white labourism. You can see, trade unionists claiming, making solidaristic links and claiming certain privileges along with white workers in South Africa, white workers in Australia. You can see it. There's a really good article, I think is also available open access, by a historian called Camilla Schofield, and it's about racism in working men's clubs in kind of post-war Britain. And you can see it there that the working men's clubs were in certain parts of industrial Britain, they constructed a sense of private space which was for workers, but specifically for white workers. That's not to say that the working class, the white section of the working class in Britain is inherently racist, is especially racist, or is solely responsible for racism. But it is to say that the history of race and class in Britain is entangled, and disentangling it involves, I think, not seeing racism or the charge of racism as being only something that applies to the people we don't agree with, that it's something that we can be, and I suppose or the white left can be too. Now, I don't think that means finger wagging at the kind of white sections of the working class, but I think it means like opening that conversation. And I actually think that there are people who are open to that conversation, and I think it can be a way of making it. So it also doesn't mean that there are not shared oppressions between the black and brown sections of the working class and the white working class, even acknowledging those kind of complexities.
100%. I guess the last question I'd like to ask is, one of the ways in which the system has clamped down on this is both sidesism. The far right and the far left are equal. To prove the point, we'll arrest some people from the far right and we'll arrest some people defending their communities, and also to push back against allegations of quote unquote two-tier policing. But then I guess the question becomes, is more policing the answer? The way that, Keir Starmer has said, they're going to create a new unit, they're going to increase policing in communities. And how has the black left historically, and not just the black left, but maybe the black anti-fascist tradition and in general, seen the relationship between state violence and street violence of the far right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't, in short, think that more policing is the answer. I think that the state has historically, and the police within it historically, had a problem with being able to see kind of ultra patriotic movements as a threat, because they walk and sound like something that they recognize rather than something that is a kind of existential threat to their power. To kind of draw on an example from the history of kind of Black British political organising, if you look at Black Power newspapers in Britain in the 1970s, they cover firebombing campaigns a lot. These campaigns of people setting fire to Black homes and businesses. They argue that these fires are either directly or indirectly part of British fascist activity. They kind of indict the National Front for those attacks. They don't just indict the National Front. They don't just mean the National Front when they talk about British fascism. They also indict Enoch Powell. They also indict the government more broadly in the way that it talks about immigration and race. They indict kind of individual politicians, and they indict the police. And they indict the judiciary when they talk about racism more broadly. They argue that the kind of racist judges slapping huge sentences on black people accused of mobbing, especially, are fascist. And they also actually, in one particular case, they cover links between, I think it's a judge called Sir Horace Lawton. They actually find that he was a British Union of Fascists candidate in the 1930s for one of their local elections. I found this candidate profile in their newspaper in the 1930s. They were correct. They also, I'm actually doing some work on this at the minute, they also identify prison officers with National Front connections and obviously make allegations about the police. The police are slightly harder to find out information about because they're not supposed to be, they're supposed to be politically neutral. And so any references to their National Front connections, they make very obliquely. There is actually an anonymous letter written to the National Front newspaper Spearhead in the 1970s by a police officer, which is a self-interested reading. But just to return to the prison officer thing, because prison officers are not civil servants, or at least not civil servants that need to be politically neutral, there's actually quite a lot of open, you can see records of prison officers with National Front connections. So they're onto something there. And I actually think there is a broader story to be told about kind of fascist links, both kind of literal and metaphoric, to the prison system and also to the immigration system. I was down at the National Archives a few months ago looking at 3 files about immigration officers at Heathrow who sent letters of support to Enoch Powell in 1968. So I think there is an intertwining of institutional and structural and what we might call extreme racism. And that's why I think in the present, we're fools if we look to the police and to the state to fight fascism, and I think this maybe speaks to what I was saying about the way that this is at the level of essentials far more, British history is implicated in fascism at the level of essentials far more than we usually talk about or acknowledge. And that's why we can't look to the same structures to fight fascism, a fascism that they are kind of part of in a sense.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining this conversation. Liam Liburd, his work is incredible. Really, really looking forward to the next paper that you're writing, because that just sounds amazing. I'm really, really looking forward to reading it. And thank you all for actually joining us, Decolonial Dialogues. And we hope you really enjoyed this. Just wanted to announce that soon we'll be launching a project called the Decolonial Club. And in the Decolonial Club, you'll also have exclusive access to certain kinds of anti-colonial and decolonial thought and courses and all sorts of stuff. We also have merchandise planned. It's really important that you try to support us because we are trying our best to rebuild anti-colonial internationalism. So just want to thank you again, Liam, for joining us. And if you have any last words to share to our audience.
Just to say that if there's anything I've mentioned, any authors or works that I mentioned in the course of this that you didn't quite catch, or if you want kind of recommendations for further reading, my email address should be publicly available. Certainly, I've got a profile on the Durham University website. So yeah, look me up.
Yeah. So thank you. Thank you all for joining us, and make sure to like and subscribe if you're on YouTube, and to follow us on Spotify and all of the major podcast services.